points, but I wanted to talk now a bit about existential philosophy and some of the ideas that underpin existential therapy. Does anybody know who this is? So this is the most important of the existential philosophers in the therapy world. Anyone know this? Heidegger, yeah. This is Martin Heidegger. It says it at the bottom. Yeah, the people at the front could all see it at the bottom. I must take that off. So Martin Heidegger is maybe not the best known of the, people often associate existentialism with Sartre, but Heidegger really is the most influential, particularly in the UK, in the existential world in the UK. And Heidegger's most famous book was Being and Time, that he wrote in the 1920s. So what Heidegger does is that he came from quite a religious background, and there was differences in kind of levels of religiosity amongst the existential philosophers. Some were very religious, some were very anti-religion. Heidegger was kind of in the middle. But what he asks is that he says that philosophy over the years, going right back to Plato, starting really from Plato and Socrates, looked at what things are and says, what is a tree, or what is a book, or what is a person. But what they don't do, and what he said that the kind of philosophers before that did, is that they don't ask the question, what is this thing called is? So what does it mean to say that something is? What does it mean to say that something has existence? What is this thing called existence that exists, that a chair exists or a person exists? But when we say that something is, what is this thing called is? How do we even begin to start thinking or describing the isness of things, the existence? If you think about how you describe what is, it's a really complex question. So Heidegger says, well, that's a really difficult question. In fact, really in his life, he never answers the question, what is being? But what he says is that why don't we start by asking about what is the nature of the being who asks the question of being? Okay, what is the nature of the person or the thing that's asking the question about being, which is human being? So he says, what can we say about human being? What do we know about human being? And that's really Being in Time, this kind of incredibly dense 400 or 500 pages, is about this question about what is this thing called human being? He kind of really asks these questions for the first time. And what he says is things like, human being is not a thing, it's not an object, and the existential therapists really talk about that we can't conceptualize people as even like a self, as like some fixed thing. Being is like a flow, and he uses a lot of Buddhist and Eastern ideas in his work, and he talks about being as this kind of flow, this process, rather than an object, an entity. And then he talks about, very importantly, he talks about the way that human being is not a kind of separate, isolated thing. It's not a kind of individual entity, but it's thrown into his world. He uses his word thrownness, the idea that we kind of emerge into this world, and that we are brought up in this world of people doing things and technology and language is all around us. All these things are around us that we don't create. We're not some individual self who creates that, but we're thrown into this world where all these things are already going on, and it's like we're kind of in this race. We wake up like there's not a kind of fixed beginning and a fixed end, but we wake up in this world where everybody is moving in one direction, or moving in different directions, and we kind of find ourselves moving along with everyone else because everybody's moving, immersed in this world. Because what he says is that, the thing that we're kind of immersed in this world, he calls it the they. He's fairly scathing about the kind of general public, the masses, and that he writes about. And he says we kind of find ourselves immersed in this world of the they. And what we're particularly immersed in is, and this is very relevant for today, is the meanings of the they. It's not so much kind of socialisation. We're socialised to wear particular clothes, or we're socialised with particular ideas. What we're most fundamentally socialised with, and what we're so socialised with we don't even realise we're socialised with, is the meanings and purposes. So we learn, for instance, that it's meaningful to be a good person. Or we learn that it's meaningful to care for others, or we learn that it's meaningful to have faith or religion. We're thrown into the world where all these things have a kind of given meaning. And as I say, we kind of race along, we charge along because everybody else is charging along in that way. And we lose ourselves in the meanings and the purposes and the directions of all these others. And most of us, for Heidegger, live our lives just lost in the world of the day. But he does also talk about the possibility of some kind of redemption or standing out. And if you compare it with, say, these humanistic therapists who talk about authenticity and being yourself, Heidegger never says, and most of the existentialists never say, you can never truly be yourself, because even as soon as you start using language, you're caught up in the world of the day, because we don't create language ourselves. And of course that leads then on to Derrida and a lot of postmodern thinking who drew very, very strongly from Heidegger. This idea of being immersed in a world that we can never escape from. Derrida, one of the key postmodern philosophers, says that we can never wrest ourselves free from the play of language. But one of the things Heidegger talks about, and he particularly talks about death, because what he says is that when we think about our deaths and when we think about mortality and when we think about the fact that we are mortal, what we begin to recognise is our own individual path, our own individual direction. We critically, because one of the things about death is nobody can die for us. Nobody can stand in for our deaths. So, if I couldn't turn up this morning and maybe somebody else could have come in, maybe somebody could have taken notes for you. But however much I might want to, I can't ask somebody here, would you mind dying for me? Sorry I got cancer, would you mind having my cancer? We can't do that. Our deaths are an individual journey that each of us must take. However terrifying it is, however scary it is, however much we lose, our deaths are a journey that we must take alone. And in taking that journey alone, if we can face that and face in some ways the aloneness of that journey, we can also recognise something about our own individuality. So for Heidegger, those moments where, as I was saying, he says that we're always kind of lost in this inauthentic world of other people's meanings and purposes. But we can find our own kind of meaning and our own destiny, he talks about sometimes, and that we find that through acknowledging our death and our mortality and our finiteness in the world. And that when we can do that, we have some possibility of an authenticity, of a kind of standing out, of a kind of recognising of the individuality and the uniqueness of who we are through facing that kind of that ultimate challenge. And that's where we can find our meaning. So he was very influential, partly because he talks about death, and some of the existential therapists like Yalom go on to that, but also particularly because he talks about this question, about this thing about being, and a lot of existential philosophy is more questions than answers. And for Heidegger, it's that question about what is this thing being, what is that human being? Sartre, this is Jean-Paul Sartre, who is another very well-known existential philosopher. It's probably the best known, but the least influential. And I think, this is based actually on a survey. We asked existential therapists about who were the most influential thinkers on their work. And Heidegger came number one, Sartre came number two. So Sartre particularly, same kind of question really, comes a little bit later than Heidegger. And it's the same question about what is this thing called being? What is this existence? But for Sartre, he particularly focuses on freedom and the idea that our existence, at any moment of existence, we have that, we are a freedom. Not even actually that we have the potentiality for freedom, but we are a freedom. At any moment now, you could say, right, I'm going to go. I'm going to leave this auditorium. Right now, you could choose to walk under a bus. Don't, please. Health and safety. But, we can make that. We can make that choice. We could choose to stand up and shout. We all, as I'll come on to much later, a lot of the time we deny it or we don't like to see ourselves as having that freedom. And certainly a lot of our psychological models and therapeutic models understand people very much in terms of causality and this happened and that happened. And Sartre is not in any way saying that things like trauma and crisis and adverse events in childhood aren't important. But what he argues is that if we just focus on that experiencing of existence and what it means to exist, we have a radical freedom at any moment to choose towards our circumstances. Not that we can choose anything, but we always have that possibility of freedom and choice that we can enact or choose not to enact. So for Sartre, we can't escape from freedom. We can choose. If we don't choose, that becomes a choice in itself. Here's Kierkegaard, who was one of the earlier existential philosophers, particularly hard reading. Kierkegaard was drawn on a lot by Heidegger, and he was particularly arguing against the kind of church of his day. He was Danish, known as the gloomy Dane. And his writing is a lot about the kind of importance of subjectivity. What we'll see in a lot of the existential philosophers is they kind of reacted against, a lot of existentialism as a reaction, that's important to understand. It is often more a kind of critique of other viewpoints than something. But a lot of the critique is against kind of mass systems of thought that essentialize people. If we think about existence as kind of what is, and essential, and the essence as kind of trying to reduce something down. And in science, for instance, is very essentialist because it tries to reduce things down to kind of their core components. And what Kierkegaard says is rather than trying to kind of understand the essence of being, what we need to focus is on the existence of being. What does it mean? And rather than kind of losing ourselves in the church, and he was very critical of the Christian church of his time, though he was a Christian, rather than losing ourselves in these kind of mass movements of church, people going to church and doing it all by routine, what we need to do is form a personal relationship with God, a subjective relationship. And instead of looking for objective truths and scientific truths and trying to say it's this or that, or even religions, he was crazy about the idea that religions were trying to kind of objectively prove the existence of God. Because what he believed was that it's much more important subjectively to know what is true, what is right for us, and to return to our own individual selves, our individual subjectivity, and to find the truth in our individual subjectivity rather than in some objective scientific knowledge. Do you know who this is? This is my favourite existential philosopher. Anybody know this guy? Sorry?
Is it Martin Buber?
Buber, yeah. That's Martin Buber. So Buber was kind of another one. He was writing, in fact, a little bit before Heidegger. Very poetic. He's a beautiful, beautiful writer, very, very poetic. If you look at Kierkegaard, and even if you look at Heidegger, although Heidegger, for instance, talk about being as kind of immersed in the world and with others, they were quite individualistic. And they particularly talk about the ways that, in some ways we need to stand out as ourselves as individuals. What Buber does is that he talks about if we're going to be authentic, and all the existentialists have different ideas about authenticity, but for Buber, authenticity is to be in relation with others. That our true selves is not some individual isolated entity, but is a being together with others. And when I was asking people about kind of what was essential to yourself, a number of people were talking about relationality. And Buber really writes about this, about that we start off in the world in this kind of relational soup. And it's only later, and some developmental psychologists have argued this as well, it's only really later that we form some sense of our individuality. But what Buber writes about is the way that our relationship with others can take one of two forms. He talks about an I-thou relationship, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, and an I-it relationship. The I-it relationship is where we treat the other as an object, as an entity, as a thing. And he says that, the word it can be replaced by he or she, and it's the same thing, because we're treating the person as an it. And you can think about many psychologies and psychotherapies which are based on diagnosis, objectification, where the patient becomes a thing that is done to by the psychotherapist. And I think Buber would argue that all comes from an I-it stance. The I-thou stance, which is the essence of an existential approach, in many ways existential therapy is about holding an I-thou stance towards our clients, is about valuing the other in their uniqueness, their subjectivity as a person rather than as a thing. And the final one that came number 5 in our top 5 existential philosophers was Nietzsche, who again is very critical about ideas about herd mentality, talks about the importance of standing up for our own values, not following others, being able to be true to ourselves.